What's up guys, Marcus here from Studio One Expert, and today we're going to be picking up with where I left off in the last two videos for my series Into the Pocket. Now if you haven't already caught the first couple videos that I did, I'd suggest going back and checking them out, and you'll be able to find the links to them at the bottom of this article here. Okay, so what I want to have a look at today is specifically using a beat detective style workflow in Studio One. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with what Beat Detective is a software that comes bundled with Pro Tools that happens to make the process of quantizing and working with multi-track drums incredibly simple. And one of the reasons that so many people use this is because of the type of workflow that it uses. So as opposed to using a time compression and expansion, what Beat Detective allows you to do is a slicing workflow where we're basically detecting transients, we're slicing the audio events on those transients, and then you're actually quantizing the beginning position of the audio event to your grid as opposed to doing any time compression or expansion. Now, there's a lot of people who think this particular method sounds better. And you know what? For the most part, if I have the time, this is always the method that I like to use. But having said that, Studio One's time compression and expansion algorithms that they have for working with percussive material are absolutely phenomenal. And I think they sound a lot better than most of the other DAWs out there. Okay, so let's just hop right in here. I don't want to do too much talking. So the first step of this process, before I do anything, before I group anything, the first thing that we need to do is we need to determine what has the groove, what tracks of these multi-track drums are carrying the groove. So first off, let's go back to the beginning of this selection over here, and I'm going to make sure that my click is engaged. And let's go to the top and let's just go ahead and play this. I'm going to zoom in a little bit while it's playing. And just try to follow along, and you can see how tight the actual drums are to the grid. Okay, so I'm sure you can hear that. For the most part, you know, they're not bad at all, but there are some parts that are definitely off. And we can see as we scroll through here, we can definitely see that some of these kick drum hits, some of them are, you know, right on the money, and some of them are pretty far off. So what we want to do is essentially we want to get these guys in the pocket. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to determine what grid we want to work to. Now I can see just visually here, if you're ever not sure, it's a pretty easy way to be able to tell is just by simply looking at things. So I've got this set to a 16th note, and you can see if I do a data zoom here so I get a little bit more resolution, you can see that these are pretty much falling on the 16th note. So for us to work in a 16th note grid mode would be perfect, because that's just basically going to allow us to snap these transients when we do the slicing to the nearest 16th note. So that's going to work out perfectly fine. All right, so the first step that we need to take whenever we're doing this type of thing is that we need to go ahead and we need to detect transients manually for any of the tracks that you want to be the guides. Now I know what you're thinking, but we can already do that by selecting the guides here. I can already create a group right here of all these drum tracks and then just select the guides. Now there's a reason for why I do this manually ahead of time, and a lot of it comes from the way that I used to work in Beat Detective, which is that I want to use the kick and the snare as my guide tracks, and I want to do the transient detection of the kick and the snare, and then I want everything else to follow that. So the way that we do that in Studio One is by selecting the event. I've got a shortcut here mapped out to detect my transients, but if you don't, you have it in a right-click option over here. This has been recently used, so I have a detect transients here, but we can also do it by clicking this button over here. Now for a kick, you want to set this to standard. Now we're going to go ahead and do an analyze. Okay, so now it's gone ahead, it's analyzed this track here. Let's have a look to see how it did. What I want to do is I want to zoom in. I want to make sure that I'm getting only the kick hits. Now I can see visually that this is pretty good. I can tell that this is a snare drum. I can tell that this is a kick. I can tell just by looking at the waveforms. So here we have a snare drum over here. Let's just go ahead and solo this out quickly. Take my click off and we'll go back to the top. Okay, so we don't want the snare hits to be happening here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull this back a little bit until I start to see the snare hits disappear. So now we've pulled that back to 57%. Now I'm just going to start scrolling across. I just want to pull back the minimum amount I need to get rid of all those snare hits. Okay, that looks like it did it. We only have the kick hits now. And like I say, I can visually see that these are kick drum hits just by the difference in the waveform. Okay, So that looks good. Oh, looks like we got one snare hit over here. I could pull this down, or I could just switch to my bend tool, select this, and delete it manually. Either one is going to work. But nevertheless, that's exactly what we need over here. Okay, so that one is now done. Go back to our pointer tool, return back to our default view. Now I want to do the exact same thing, and I'm going to do it for the snare track. So I'm going to use my shortcut. Okay, now I've got all my snare hits. You can see this is pretty easy visually to see whether these are on or not. So I can, pull them back and then just dial it up just enough until I have them all. And that's everything there. So that setting is going to work. So now I've got the transient detection done for my kick and snare, which is where my groove is for this particular drum track. Okay, so the next thing I want to do here is, now that I've done a transient detection for these events manually before I've gone ahead and grouped anything, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of my drum tracks. I'm going to do a Command G or Control G on a PC, and that will create a group there. I'm just going to leave it set to group 1, and now I can manually come in and make sure that my guides are set to kick and snare. Okay, so now that my guides are set to kick and snare, and now that I have a group, if I select any of these events, it's going to select everything. Let's just toggle bend marker on here. Okay, so now what we have here is we have all of the events selected, they're grouped together, we have the guide set here, and now what I can do, because we have the proper quantize grid set for our grid value, we can zoom in here just to have a look at everything. We can see how the transient detection went. It did a really good job of detecting these transients over here. So now with everything selected over here, what I want to do now at this point is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make sure that for my action, I'm set to slice instead of quantize. And I want to quantize on track, and I want to quantize to 100%. So with all these tracks selected over here, let's go ahead and click apply. Okay, so you can see what happened here. It's cut up everything based on the transient detection, the bend markers that we have over here. And I can scroll through these points over here, and we can see that for the most part, it's done a really, really good job. Our transients are lining up pretty well, right on the money with the start of the event where it was cut. But you'll notice we have all these overlaps over here. Now, this in itself is not necessarily a bad thing, but when you're working with drums and when you want to start working with crossfades, it happens to be a little bit of a pain in the butt. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I've got a macro that I've created, which I'm going to include in this article, in the text portion of this article, that basically goes through all of the events and it's going to kill any overlaps. So I'm going to go ahead now and I'm going to run that macro. And as I say, this is something that I am going to include in the actual video. So I've got this mapped out to a single keyboard shortcut, and it's set to happen 25 times. And I'll be able to see at whichever event is left over highlighted, that's where it finished. And if I have to run it again, it's not going to hurt anything, even if I have to run it for 5 more instances as opposed to 25. So let's go ahead and run that macro. Okay, so now I've run that macro. Let's go back home for a second. I'm going to zoom in, and I want to bring this back. And let's zoom in, and let's just make sure that this did exactly what we needed it to. So I'm scrolling through, and I want to make sure that I don't have any overlaps. So I'm just scrolling through. I don't see any overlaps at all. So that looks like it's done its job, exactly what we needed it to do. Perfect. Okay, now I'm going to go home, zoom out a little bit. So that's the first step. Now the second thing I'm going to do here is just to give myself a little bit of wiggle room. I'm going to take this section over here, and let's just go ahead and delete this because we're going to start everything from bar 2. Now the next thing I want to have a look at over here is I want to quickly have a look at the behavior that Studio One has when you have globally events selected, when you have global events selected across all tracks or all of the events. So for instance, I'm going to do a Command A, Control A on a PC, and let's just go to any part here. For instance, we could go to this section over here. And I want you to watch what happens if I were to pull even any of these events. If I was to go to the back end of any of these events and start pulling it, see what happens? Everything is moving. All of these events, they're all moving. So that's one behavior that we have to be aware of. And it's the exact same for on the front end. As you can see, as I'm trimming it, it's happening across all the tracks. So this is just something to keep in mind, and this is all going to make sense a little bit later on in the video. Now, the next thing that I want to do here is essentially one of the major things that makes Beat Detective so easy and so nice to work with when you're working in Pro Tools is the way that it handles the crossfades and basically filling in these empty spaces that are left. So anytime that we have audio that was pushed down the timeline, as you noticed before, we had some overlapping events that you could see behind this event, and that's because this was moved down. But anytime that we have to have an audio event that was quantized and the beginning of that transient to be put on a bar or a downbeat, it had to move it over earlier in time, we'll be left with this gap here. Now, the problem with this is that if I pull this out here, you'll notice that we're going to have a double hit. We have the exact same transient happening back to back, and we don't want that at all. So the idea here is what we do want to do is we want to pull this out, and we want to actually pull this back, and we want to add some crossfades here. Now, this is one of the things that Beat Detective does really nicely because it allows you to predetermine a selected amount of a trimming pad or trim pad in terms of milliseconds. And, a number that happens to work really nice is 10 milliseconds. So what we have to do here is we have to mimic this behavior in Studio One. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and undo that. Now, first things first, just because I've done this enough and I know that this can sometimes happen, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the end with everything selected, so we can do a Command D or Control D to unselect everything. I'm going to do a Command A to select everything. And let's just do a data zoom quite a bit here so we can see. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the end of one of the events here. As long as I have everything selected, I'm just going to pull this back. Not too much, just a little bit. Even that much is going to be enough to do what we need to do. So that's the first thing that I'm going to do. Okay. Now the second thing that I want to do, let's go ahead and bring our data zoom back down to something a little more natural, is again with everything selected, Command A or Control A on a PC, I'm going to do a Shift X. What that's going to do is that's going to give me a 10 millisecond fade in and a 10 millisecond fade out across everything. So if I move through all my event boundaries here, you'll notice that that's done a fade in and a fade out on all of these events. Okay? Now that's exactly what I want. Now again, while leaving everything selected, and this is important, you have to make sure that all of your events are selected. What I'm going to do is I'm going to change the actual fade type. So again, sometimes just to be sure, I will deselect everything, Command D, Command A, or Control A to reselect all of the events on the timeline here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this, I'm just going to push it up just until I see that snap to logarithmic. Boom, just like that. I don't want to go too hard, just wait till it snaps. And I'm going to do the exact same thing on the fade out. Okay, so now what this has given us is we know that this fade length is exactly 10 milliseconds. This fade in is exactly 10 milliseconds. So keeping in mind and keeping our fingers crossed that Studio One has done its job correctly and the event start of this exact point here is sitting exactly on a zero crossing of a transient, then we know that if we were to pull this audio back, which as I mentioned before, if we have all of the events selected and I pull something back, I'm doing that to everything. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to zoom in a little bit to give myself a little bit of resolution. And again, with everything selected, I'm going to hover my cursor over the edge of the beginning of one of the events, and I'm going to pull this back. I'm going to match this crossfade up by I. Okay, so now what we have is essentially, we have now our, 10 millisecond, well, in this case, it's a little more than 10 millisecond, but that's not going to be a big deal. We have our 10 millisecond crossfade before the transient. So let's go back to the very beginning over here. And what I'm going to do is I now have another macro that's basically just a slightly different version of a Shift Option or a Shift Alt N to move through to my region boundaries over here. Sorry, my event boundaries. What I've done is I've mapped this out to be pretty much the exact same process with one exception, that before it moves to the next event boundary or event start, it deselects everything. So now I've mapped that out to option N and option B. And I've done that just so it's easy for me to memorize that and it makes sense with my markers and everything else, all my other shortcuts. So now what we can do is I can go through all of these one by one and I can just double check these. And because I've opted to deselect all the audio events before I move to that event boundary, I have guidance and reassurance that I'm not going to be adjusting anything that doesn't need to be adjusted. So now, again, I'm going to move through. Option N is going to move me through to my next one. And the point of this is simply to make sure it's twofold. First of all, I want to make sure that I don't have any double transients here that are happening. And second of all, I just want to make sure that I have a nice crossfade. And if we have some information that's happening in the hi-hat that happens before either the snare or the kick, it's very easy for us to just pull this back and reveal that information. Now you may ask yourself, why did I do a logarithmic fade as opposed to doing a standard fade? And the reason for that is actually very simple. It's because if you do a fade, you'll notice if I take this one fade and I was to pull this down, see what happens here. See how this kind of goes in, and you can see almost, if I zoom this up a little bit, you can see that it comes down and then up again. If I undo this, you'll notice that this is a better option for fading. If you have your crossfade set properly at the right point, you're not going to hear anything. This will be incredibly transparent. Okay, so I'm moving through. Again, my option N is going to bring me to my next one. Okay, now you'll notice here we've got a little bit of a problem. We've got a gap here. We don't have a crossfade at all. Because we've already set this up and we already have the fade ins and the fade outs, we can basically just grab this event here, pull it back, even a tiny little bit of overlap, that's okay, and then I can click X, and that automatically adds the same 10 millisecond crossfade, and I have the proper logarithmic fade in and fade out. Now you'll notice here, as soon as I did that, that we see a bit of information here. That's because this track had to be moved, had to be adjusted this different. So this would actually, if I had this too close, we'd have a flam, we'd have a double hit. So what I can do now is I can simply grab this and make sure as I'm moving through, I can make sure that I don't have any flams at all. And I want to show you something else really cool. If we have any discrepancies where Studio One didn't do a perfect job, if you watched my sampling video on how to phase align samples, you may have remembered that there's a little trick we can do, which is where we can slip the audio within an event. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to deselect everything. Before I do any of these procedures, whether it's adjusting a crossfade or whether it's slipping the audio, I always do a Command D to deselect everything, because if I'm working and I'm super zoomed in, I might be affecting a bunch of other audio events that might be highlighted and selected without me knowing. So whenever I do anything when I'm zoomed up this close working, I always do a deselect all. So now if I want to fix this, I can just do an option command and I can just bring this back and slide that over, and I'm not affecting anything else. Okay, so option N to move over. Again, same thing over here. I can just move this back, deselect. I can pull this and I can adjust this around. Usually I let this go the full length right up to the transient because I want the natural sustain and decay of all the drums happening here. The only exception to this rule is if I feel like I notice that there's something, for instance, where I see that there might be some intricate hi-hat work that is happening before a downbeat. So it's something that you have to keep an eye out for. Okay, so that one looks fine. This one, you see that we don't have a perfect crossfade. So this is very easy to fix. We select the event on the right, and I just click X. That automatically fixes it. Deselect all by doing Command D, and then I can readjust this, and I want to make sure that I don't have any of this double transient happening here. Okay, so now I'm just going to move through here, and instead of talking, I'm just going to kind of move through and show you how easy and fast this is to do. So you're not going to see anything different than I've already said. All I'm going to be doing is using my option N, which is going to move to the next event start, and then I'm going to be using, if I need to, I'm going to be using my slip audio command to slip this over, and I'm going to be doing a deselect all in between everything. Anytime that I adjust a fade or anytime I slip the audio, I make sure that I've deselected everything that I'm working with, and then you won't have any errors whatsoever. So let me just go ahead and just work on this, and I'm just going to kind of stop talking for a second so you can see how fast this is. Okay, so we're pretty much done here. Now you notice that one thing here is I want to slip this back, but as I try to do it, I have to make sure that I've trimmed off a little bit on the end, otherwise I have nothing to trim. So if you ever find yourself in this situation where you can't trim anything, that's the reason. And then of course we'll just bring this back to make sure that we're good at the top. Now I haven't listened to anything, and I'm not sure if you caught it, but there was one area that I had to pull back quite a bit because there was something happening with the hi-hat before that transient happened. So what I want to do now is let's go back to the very top here. Go back to the very top of the track, select everything, go ahead and just turn these into an audio part just for a second. Let's bring this down. Let's bring in our click. Let's listen from the top. And I want you guys to, do some critical listening to see how this sounds. Okay, so there you have it. Absolutely crystal clear, nice and transparent. I didn't hear any flamming. I didn't hear any weird phasing. These are, we haven't done any time compression or expansion, and we've just basically, done a simple workflow that just by using a couple macros, we're able to very easily adjust our drums so that we have this nice, performance, that we have these nice dynamics and we don't have to use any time compression or expansion. And you know what? You just listened to a video of me blabbing for however long, and I understand that this took a while in context, but I really just wanted to kind of give you guys an overview so you understand how to do this and why to do this. But in reality, once you start plowing through this and once you understand the workflow and understand how to make it work for you, you can do this really, really, really quick. It really honestly does not take that much time at all. And you know what? It's one of those things where when you have the time and you're working on an album budget, you're going to thank yourself for doing this style of workflow as opposed to quantizing, because it just, it sounds great. And then, like I said, the advantage of Studio One is that we can just take everything here and I could just temporarily turn this into an audio part by clicking the G key. Now I can go ahead and I can treat these as regular tracks. Or if you're happy and you want to commit to this, you could easily take this audio part and you could bounce this down. But what I would probably do is I would leave this as an audio part till I'm 100% sure. There might be something once I start, compressing the snot out of the drums with a parallel compression bus or something. I might hear that I need to make a slight adjustment to one of my crossfades, or I might hear a little bit of a flanging or a little bit of a flam that I didn't catch. But generally, you know what? When you work with this type of workflow and you use these shortcuts and these macros, this makes it a really, really quick process. So again, super transparent, really easy to do, and you can get great results. I hope you guys got something from this, and we'll talk to you soon. Cheers.